Very excited today to show you my Clay workflow. Been working on this for a week now, and we have real campaigns started with leads flowing through it. So let's jump in. You could already see my screen. The first major step in my workflow is using the zero bounce validation to determine whether or not this is a valid email. This is an important first check, but before I even run this check will use up credits. It uses up one Clay credit every time you call this particular validation. So before I even run this check, you'll see that I have this only run if I have an email and I have cleared it because there has been no other email sent to this domain in the last 7 days. Now that's the part I really want to show you today, and it's the ability to check whether you have already sent an email to a particular company that uses the same domain name in the last X number of days. Now I like to wait at least 7 days, but you can configure it in here before I send another email to a different person at the same company. I do that for email deliverability purposes because I don't want to have my sender domain blowing up the recipient domain at the same time. So this output really depends on a couple of items that you'll see here. What I'm going to do is find multiple domains in this table, and I'll show that to you in a minute. I'm going to check how many records come back, and if it is only one record, then this is clear to send because this is the record that we have. However, if there is more than one record, then we need to check whether the last time we touched this domain was greater than 7 days. And that's what we have in this section here. We look at the number of records, we see if there's more than one. If there is, we compare right now, this moment, to the last touch on the domain, and it must be greater than 7. So what you see here, this check mark means that this is true. Well, shouldn't have touched that. And now we can, if this check mark is true, then I go ahead and run this email validation. If it's not true, that means that the prospect that we're trying to bring into the system has been touched recently, and it may not be worth going through the whole workflow of credits to set them up for a campaign. So I promised I'd show you how I set this up. Let's take a quick look. I am looking for these columns here. Let's jump over there. I'm going to scroll across, and a couple of things are going on to help me set this up. And I'll work backwards so you can see what's going on. What's going on here is I'm looking for this particular value, the domain last touch. And the way I'm calculating the last domain touch is I'm finding all of the records that come from repeating domains, which is this field right here. I'll show that to you in a minute. And then I am using these functions to sort them by date and then find the last one. And so with this, you could see that the last time I touched a particular domain, OpSWAT, was essentially, this is my marking for I haven't, or I don't have a valid date, okay? And in cases where I have touched them, for instance, earlier today, then I have this here, July 30th, 2024. Now, how am I finding this data here? Well, I configured this column. It's called Find Repeating Domains, and it searches this table for a domain must be equal to a domain. And we're looking at this value here. And so the output of this is that if ignite.com is only found once in this entire table, then we're only going to get one record. And we'll see that record here, and it's all the rows, all the columns of this record from this table. However, if I have emailed 2 people from silverfort.com, for instance, then we'll find 2 records, and we'll see both of those records there. And so we can see that I emailed Maya at Silverfort and Tal at Silverfort. And this is really what brought me to this realization and this need to create this check. I really dislike emailing people from the same domain. And as I started to add more and more prospects into the system, I realized I had to add a check here to make sure and police this kind of activity. So to recap, so far we have We're able to find when there are multiple prospects in the system that have the same domain. We're able to then pull out which one is the last touch. And so that's what I want to show you next. How do we determine when is the last touch of a domain? For each email, or each row rather, in this table, I have created two things. One, a webhook timestamp, and I have that in a different table. And every time the Smart Leads campaign sends out an email, I have it post a webhook back into Clay. You'll see that here. This is what the webhook looks like. Every time an email is sent out, it logs the time that the email was sent out, the campaign name, the description, the email type, etc. Okay. So I'm fetching that, and we'll go back to where we were here. So I'm fetching that in this column. In addition to that, I am looking at the last timestamp for when I sent a lead to Smart Leads. And that's important because in some cases you send leads to Smart Leads, but they're not yet sent. And yet, in the time in between you setting up the lead to be sent out and the time it actually gets sent out, it could be several days, depending on the rules for the campaign that you've set up in Smart Lead. What that means is that if you try to add additional prospects in that, let's say, 3-day period, if you only rely on the webhook, then you'll be in a situation where you may not have accurate data. So here I have an additional timestamp which is triggered based off of the moment that I added a lead or updated a lead to Smart Lead. And you can see that here when the lead goes updated. We'll take a look. It says, was there an OK value from this, essentially a check mark? And if there was, then create a timestamp for it. So if it checks out OK, then create a new timestamp for right now, else create a fictitious timestamp, the year 1900. This just helps me check to make sure that there is or is not data there. And since this is a date formatted column, then it means that you can't just put blanks. You have to actually put some value in Clay. Okay, so with this and this, what I then do is create a third column, which is a merge of the two. Effectively, I say, look at the Smart Lead webhook timestamp and take the maximum of either the later of the timestamp for when I sent a lead into Smart Lead or the timestamp from the webhook itself and get the later of those two dates. Now what this gives me is the last time I touched this particular prospect via an email. And then from that, what will flow is we'll find multiple records, as you see here, that share the same domain. So let's do an example so you can see what this means. I'm going to put this in. We're going to add a filter for, let's say, a domain. We'll do weka.io because I see it has two values there. Oh, it has one value. Perfect. Let's do that. Okay, so what this is saying is there's only one record here, and this domain was last touched on 7/30. So what would happen, for instance, if we were to add a new row? Let's add myself to this. Okay, and here's the important part. I'm going to say rod@weka.io. As soon as I do that, that's going to start triggering some of those earlier formulas that I just mentioned. And what it's going to do, first of all, it's going to find that we don't have an email to that particular person yet. So that makes sense. And then it's going to say, well, the last time we touched them is essentially never, the year 1900. However, we do have a domain already in this table that matches the @domain of that email address. Okay, so it found two records. And then it performs this function that I showed you, and it says, well, the last time we touched that record was July 30th. We know that because it comes from this value here, July 30th. And so as a result, this will return false. It's not checked. That means that this particular row, this prospect, is not cleared to be emailed. Do not touch him because it hasn't been more than 7 days. Now, as an example, what if we, for instance, updated the last email touch date? Now I'm going to do this manually, but let's say we had emailed them on July 20th instead. Okay, then let's go ahead and rerun this row. I'll just do that example again so you could see it. Okay, rod@weka.io. And now all those formulas are running. Let's take a look at them. And it's now going to compare the last touch date is 7/20. Last touch date is 7/20. So let's take a look at our formula. And now we're clear to run. So now if I go ahead and I click this particular email validation step, it will proceed because this is true. So I love this because I can keep adding all kinds of prospects and I don't have to go elsewhere to check whether or not I have already emailed someone else from the company. I'm doing that natively within Clay using all free formulas, no paid for credit enrichments at all. And it's just a great way to set up a pre-step between the adding of a prospect and then the triggering of the complete waterfall of events that will happen after the fact. And that's important because every time I send approximately emails to 100 prospects, it might be using approximately 300 credits depending on the waterfall of those events that happen. 300 credits at the middle plan comes out to about $12 for every 100 prospects that you successfully add to a smart lead campaign. It ain't cheap, but it is a lot more cost effective than, of course, hiring an additional person to do all of the steps manually that I'm otherwise having to do using this automation workflow. Okay, we'll stop there because that's a lot of content and look forward to any questions.